Hello everyone and welcome to part 4B of the Legalities series. You all know what this is about by now, so let's not waste any time. We'll continue on from last time with condition G10, interest and apportionments starting from clause 1. If the actual completion date is after the agreed completion date, for any reason other than the seller's default, the buyer must pay interest at the interest rate on the money due from the buyer at completion for the period starting on the agreed completion date and ending on the actual completion date. Clause 2. Subject to condition G11, don't worry, we'll get there. The seller is not obliged to apportion or account any sum at completion unless the seller has received that sum in cleared funds. The seller must promptly pay to the buyer after completion any sum to which the buyer is entitled that the seller subsequently receives in cleared funds. Clause 3. Income and outgoings are to be apportioned at the actual completion date unless A. The buyer is liable to pay interest and B. The seller is given notice to the buyer at any time up to completion requiring apportionment from the date from which interest becomes payable to the buyer, in which event income and outgoings are to be apportioned on the date which interest becomes payable by the buyer. Clause 4. Apportionments are to be calculated on the basis that A. Seller receives income and is liable for the whole of the day on which the apportionment is to be made. B. Annual income and expenditure accrues at an equal daily rate, assuming 365 days a year, 366 for a leap year. And income and expenditure relating to some other period at an equal daily rate during the period it relates. And C. Where the amount to be apportioned is not known at completion, apportionment is to be made by reference to a reasonable estimate and further payment by seller or buyer as appropriate within 5 business days of the day that the amount is known. On to clause 5. If a payment due from the buyer to the seller on or after completion is not paid on the due date, the buyer is to pay interest to the seller at the interest rate on that payment from the due date up to the date of payment. Now moving on to section G11, arrears, part 1. Clause 1. Current rent means, in respect of each of the tenancies subject to which the lot is sold, the instalment of rent and other sums payable by the tenant on the most recent payment date on or within 4 months preceding completion. Clause 2. If on completion there are any arrears of current rent, the buyer must pay them, whether or not the details of those arrears are given in the special conditions. Clause 3. Parts 2 and 3 of this condition G11 do not apply to arrears of current rent. On to Clause 4, which is part 2 of condition 11, applies where the special conditions give details of arrears. Clause 5. The buyer is to pay on completion in addition to any other money due an equal amount to all arrears of which details are set out in the special conditions. Clause 6. If those are not old arrears, the seller is to assign to the buyer all rights that the seller has to recover those arrears. Right, on to part 3 of condition G11, buyer not to pay for arrears. Clause 7. Part 3 applies where the special conditions either A. so state or B. give no details of arrears. On to clause 8. While any arrears are due to the seller remain unpaid, the buyer must A. try to collect them in the ordinary course of management but need not take legal action or forfeit the tenancy. B. Pay them to the seller within 5 business days of receipt in clean funds plus interest calculated on a daily basis for each subsequent day's delay in payment. C. On request, at the cost of the seller, assign to the seller or as the seller may direct the right to demand and sue for old arrears. Such assignment to be in such form as the seller's conveyancer may reasonably require. D. If reasonably required, allow the seller's conveyancer to have on loan the counterpart of any tenancy against an undertaking to hold it to the buyer's order. E. Not without consent of the seller, release any tenant surety from liability to pay arrears or accept the surrender of or forfeit any tenancy under which arrears are due, and F. If the buyer disposes of the lot prior to recovery of all arrears obtained from the buyer's successor in title, a covenant in favour of the seller in similar form to part 3 of condition G11. Clause 9. Where the seller has right to recover arrears, it must not be without the buyer's written consent. bring insolvency proceedings against a tenant, or seek removal of goods from the lot. And that brings this part to a close, everyone. There's still more to cover, so be sure to join us next time and have a lovely day.